You've reached the Signal Watch, movies, television, comics, and more. I'm your host, Ryan Steens. Join me and our cadre of co-contributors as we examine cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explore the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay tuned. We're gonna try to make this work. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Steens. And with me today, we have a very special guest.
Hi, I'm Stephen Harms, and this is my second podcast here on Signal Watch.
And you tapped me for this one.
Right.
What did you choose?
I chose Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America.
Now, I'm curious as to why you wanted to do this, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own experience with the movie.
Yeah, super. I'd heard about this movie. It tends to be mentioned in the same breath with The Godfather. They both were released roughly about within 3 years of each other. And it's famous sort of apocryphal story that Leone passed on producing The Godfather or directing The Godfather in order to direct this. So, my belief was that these were sort of comparable films. And also, the last film I covered on Signal Watch was Clockwork Orange, and you urged me to choose something maybe a little milder. So I guess I'm stepping down from the old ultraviolence to Lower East Side gang warfare.
I find kind of the conversation around Once Upon a Time in America kind of fascinating. When I was in film school, and you're talking 93 to 98. Because I did the victory lap. I was not in college for 4 years. Leone was for some of us God. Like, we understood what he was making, but we also understood the craft with which he made it. We didn't feel like, there's, we need to build a philosophy around this movie or anything, but you rarely actually at that time in the 90s heard people talking about Once Upon a Time in America. It was out there. You could get it on video. And basically I made it through some of the Westerns and then was like, this has De Niro. This has Woods. This has Elizabeth McGovern. Why? This has William Forsythe, for God's sakes. Why have I never heard of it? And I'd never talked to anyone who had seen it, and went and rented it. It was a 2-tape set. And, at the time, it kind of melted my brain. And I would point out, I was in the middle of film school when I watched it. And so from a lot of perspectives, it really hit me hard. I mean, visually, no matter what you think of the story or its execution, to me, it is a beautiful film. It is one of the best shot things I can point to. If I was to say, turn off the sound on something and watch it, just watch it, this would be one of those movies. Um, but over the years, I've also come to recognize maybe it's not as tight as it could be. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So
Sure.
I'll let you kick off as someone, because I've seen the movie probably 6 or 7 times. This was my first time to watch the super extended 4 hour cut. So
Super. Yeah. So this is my first and only watch of it, and likewise, it was the full and extended cut. You know, I I put myself in sort of the headspace of 92 to 97 sort of film watching. And I think a lot of Leone was reinterpreted through Quentin Tarantino. We got exposed to a lot of those tropes. It's hard not to see Kill Bill 1 and 2 as extensions. Well, Kill Bill 1, actually, more specifically, as an extension of the archetypes that Leone put together with The Man with No Name Western series. So even if we didn't know we were watching Leone, we were watching Leone reinterpreted by a great fan, Tarantino. To the point that he even named one of his movies, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, clearly referencing this as well. So I recognize the craftsmanship. And you can hear the giant butt coming. I recognize the craftsmanship. I recognize the filming as being gorgeous. But for me, this kind of underperformed compared to where I would look at, say, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think that's it's a much more insightful story in my experience. I found it to be, I feel that Good, Bad, the Ugly says something about America, whereas I'm not really sure that Once Upon a Time in America quite gets there. I don't have a background in film. I did read a lot. In my 5 years at university, yay, victory laps. I read a lot of philosophy, read a lot of literature. And I recognize when there's some editing that might have been applied, and I just feel like this story doesn't quite get America in the way that The Godfather does. And it also just kind of feels like a lot of hijinks, that drives a plot, but the plot's not really in service of anything. And so I guess I'm kind of trying to come to this film less as I have a strong view on this, like where I'd be with, say, Clockwork Orange, and more like I'm trying to understand, did I miss something in what I should be appreciating? And what you just suggested there is a level of technical appreciation that maybe I'm falling short on. But I do agree that visually it was amazing. I do enjoy the technical craft of that. But the flip side of the great camera work is that I thought the sets were really underwhelming. Like I was expecting to be transported to Lower East Side Manhattan, circa 1920. And instead, it just felt like I was on a big soundstage the whole time, which I understand budgets are budgets, but I never really felt like I broke through into being in that time and in that era, despite the fact that it was presented beautifully from a technical and lighting level. So please educate me.
Yeah, well, first of all, they didn't use sets. I think that's probably important. I mean, there were definitely some things that were sets. A lot of it was shot on the streets of Brooklyn. It was shot in Rome. That's how you get a lot of the older style buildings when they're doing those kind of wide. Leone does a shot in Once Upon a Time in the West where he follows Jill from the train to the train station and then to the cart, and then she rides the cart out.
Right.
One of my favorite shots in cinema. In this one, you really get is like Deborah exiting and then kind of walking through the streets, and there's kind of a crane shot there where he's able to get these long shots. And to me, that actually feels, I mean, I've only been in Manhattan a couple of times. I am not familiar with it. If you asked me where the Lower East Side was, I would go, what side am I on now? Probably below that.
Yeah.
So I have no frame of reference. And so it has the shots that they, used real locations, like the shots of the bridge in the background, the shots of that they do then in Rome, where they're trying to double it for kind of the slums, kind of the Jewish ghetto in New York. And I'm not as super familiar with all of that.
Okay.
And I don't know, as a New Yorker, which you are, it sounds to me like it did not feel like it resonated as New York.
It didn't feel that way. And, I think that's a fair point, which is that, if you see a place regularly, you'll have different calibrations about what that thing looked like. And to be fair, the area that they used for the set sort of around, around Moe's or of the classic era is that was in now Williamsburg, which is now quite a hip and up and, now it's thoroughly gentrified. So what had happened is that there's wave after wave of arson in that part of Brooklyn during that era, where basically people were like, as follow-alongs to the quote white flight problem, landlords are basically burning down their buildings. And so you see this reflected in a lot of what Brooklyn looked like, because there are lots burnt down left and right. And it's like, I don't have the money to bring this to code. I can't make enough on the money, so I'm going to burn it down. And this led to a number of lots being cleared. And so as a result, what would have felt more like built up New York, where you'd see like row house, tenement, row house, it a lot of them been burnt or demolished, and that creates that wide space that may be what I associate with a sound stage. It looks kind of artificially constructed, but also fair point. Those areas where they probably were filming were probably part of city rehabilitation, and as a result had kind of been artificially sterilized to create that wide surrounding space instead of the crowdedness that I would have predicted in a story of this type. But
yeah. And I was wondering about that. I would never say anything is like some other city to me, like it really captured the essence of city, because I have only really lived in Austin long enough to ever, and maybe Houston and Phoenix, to ever really say, yeah, that feels accurate. But if the story to me, I agree. The Godfather gets at something about America in a way that I think feels maybe less personal. Like, I feel like this story does that. It has a lot of the same sort of themes of what's going on with political corruption, what's going on with unions, what's going on with how everybody gets compromised. But it's doing it as the backdrop to a very personal story between Max and Noodles.
Right.
And that to me feels like it, because of that secondary tier to it, they don't talk enough about it to where it doesn't really feel like it's saying much about it. Instead, it's taking it for granted. The Treat Williams character in this movie, especially, I really actually enjoyed the extended cut. It ended up really filling in some gaps for me that had existed in the movie previously. Treat Williams in this movie is super effing important, and he's only in it for like 5 minutes. And when you're in the original cut, he's in it even less. Because that whole conversation where Treat Williams and James Woods are talking about like what's actually happening is not in the original cut. You have to infer all of that. So, I mean, I think it was ill-placed in this movie, but they had to get it out there on the table somehow with the extended cut. I think they should have had a hard cut to Noodle showing up at the party, and that's when Woods turns around and he gasp, and maybe Williams is in the room at that point, and he bears witness to that conversation or something. But and of course, I think it's about a lot of this stuff of, what does it mean to have these memories of things and believe in something that happened. And this is a very noir thing, is, what come out of the past, right, is the film noir everybody's told to go watch. It's something from your past is coming back to haunt you now. And that's a theme you see in, I'd say, a third to half of noir. And this definitely, like, that's how it starts off. He's summoned back to New York, someone who knows who he is. And then you follow through this thread of his relationship with Deborah as well. That I find the stuff with Deborah kind of shattering and moving. And it, including the fact that the rape scene, which I know would just
rough.
just really fucking rough. And probably from our perspective in 2022 goes on for approximately 98% too long. You get the idea, and it just keeps going. So, which I think is Leone actually saying something about who Noodles is when you're sitting there, seeing him as almost it's a reminder he's not a heroic figure in a lot of ways. She doesn't just serve that, but it's what she represents about America and trying to achieve and get beyond where she's from. And he's trying to take her by force. And I think there's a lot of stuff like that there's not exactly a pin the tail on the donkey thing on it and it's maybe not as artfully told as Godfather 1 and 2, which are, I think, widely understandable, even though everything's subtext in those movies.
Yeah, I and I think that scene, which I loved, and I was one of my favorite scenes, was the scene where I think it's Max as James Woods is basically explaining to Treat Williams' character, Jimmy O'Donnell, that this is the way power really works, and you either accept the fact that you're going to be on the downside of the wheel, or you forgot how to get on the top side of that wheel. And it very much recalled the dialogue between Michael Corleone and the senator in Nevada, where he says, you and I, Senator, are part of the same hypocrisy, but never think that extends to my family. Power is power. And I think that was what I saw in, The Godfather, and kind of some of these hints that you see in Good, Bad, the Ugly, where the man with no name kind of wanders through the desolation of the Civil War and just the raw carnage of it and says, what was this all about? I think Leone has that capability. And I think you're absolutely right. I think those notes just make the movie so great. And also the greatness of, I don't think enough can be said, is like watching, 8-year-old Jennifer Connelly basically set up a pivotal character that basically carries Robert De Niro and James Woods as adult versions through, 3-hour movie is just an amazing testament to her capacity at that young of an age. So the Deborah arc is beautifully acted both by young Jennifer Connelly and Elizabeth McGovern. All of those are great, and I just feel like there are hints that Sergio Leone kind of got what America was about, but I somehow just never quite hits home the way that. That opening scene of The Godfather with Bonacera and Don Corleone, he lays it out. America is something about, like, I don't know what America is, I won't pretend that, but it certainly has something to do with money. It has something to do with religion, and it has something to do with family, and it has something to do with corruption. There's something about that relationship that seems to set up all great storytelling. It's tough to basically say that like some of these master stories that we or these master narratives that we apply to American identity are fraught. And when we scratch a little bit below the surface, it gets uncomfortable for maybe some region or some type of people. And then you scratch a little bit further and it gets way more uncomfortable. It becomes massively indicting. And I think somehow The Godfather seduces us all into basically wanting to what part we're complicit in it. And this, it felt still a little bit kind of like cops and robbers. It felt like there's like, I wouldn't have been surprised if at some point, the bell-headed kind of beat cop, conked young James Woods on the head, and it jump cut to him with like big X's over his eyes and Tweety birds flitting about. It felt very kind of Keystone Cops in moments, and those ate up a lot of runtime. And then all of a sudden, you get to these great sort of moments where you're just like, oh my God, this is horrible. Specifically, the rape scene stands out. Specifically, the kind of stabbing that gets Noodles locked up in the initial case. It felt like a lot of hijinks, like an episode of The Sandlot with a body count, and then all of a sudden it jumps into this really heavy part, and then there's more hijinks as Noodles comes out, and then there's this really heavy part, and then it's over. And I felt like the tonal shift kind of ruined, or not to say ruined, it just lessened the impact of that big, deeper insight about what it is to try to get ahead in America.
So I think that's a really interesting insight into how this movie is structured and how it's made. And it's entirely possible. So Leone had wanted to make this movie for like 10, 12 years before he was able to make it. He'd read this book that was by Harry Gray. In theory, it is based on a true story or reflects what actually happened with Harry Gray, who claims to have been a low rent mobster during Prohibition, and I guess actually did run away at some point. And the portion of him like returning is considered to be possibly fantasy. When I'm watching the movie, when you describe it that way, I think I had internalized a lot of that stuff as this is how we talk about the hijinks of our youth, right? This is like we got into a scrape and everything was crazy. It's like almost like that kind of storytelling. Of
Right.
course, the cop is cartoonish because when you're talking about something when you're 13 and you got away with something, the story's a cartoon. And I think that is actually true about this movie. Of it doesn't have enough of a consistent feel. It starts with this super dark scene of not really describing who Eve is, but you know she's somehow tied up with De Niro and her getting assassinated, essentially. Um, and then yeah, you get into these flashbacks, and it's like it is wacky hijinks of kids. The thing that is a real life reflection of this, the comic artist Jack Kirby spent a lot of time, kind of in his later years, talking about what it was like growing up in the Jewish ghetto, which is something that has been somewhat glossed over by most of history of kind of these various pockets are not what gets written up in the history books, and it's kind of this weird thing that Kirby, who at the time was Jacob Kurtzenberg or something, I can't remember what his actual real name was. Um, he was in a bunch of low rent gangs. That's what you did. You fought for your block, your couple of blocks or whatever, and you were like, he happened to kind of get out of all of that because he liked to draw and basically pursued that and got enough money to go to art school and stuff, and make his way out of the ghetto. But that's a lot of what they're showing there. It very much reflects how he talks in his narratives about what his youth was like. Of we were a bunch of shitty kids. Our parents were all working too much to pay any attention to us, and you
Right.
ended up just getting up to a bunch of bullshit. Um, that was mostly criminally related, and we were sometimes putting out each other's eyes with pipes and rocks or whatever was laying around. We didn't have guns, but you were fighting tooth and claw for whatever your piece of land was. Um, there's not much of that sort of stuff here, but what there is the kids scraping to survive with parents who are just totally not paying attention to them. But yeah, anyway, it I do like that it captures some of this picture of a neighborhoods and kind of a history that's been swept under. But I do agree it does maybe lessen the impact of whatever the greater thing is that Leone is trying to say about those larger things. But I think he got so focused on the arc of this interpersonal relationship between the triangle of Max and Noodles and Deborah that everything else became secondary to him.
I think it makes sense. I've kind of been a little bit cool on the story here, but the performances, I can't say enough about the. If you were to try to pull at heartstrings in a more effective way, I don't know that it would be possible. To the extent that young Deborah is absolutely an angel of the Jewish ghetto. You understand just how tender and how beautiful and how promising she is. From the moment she takes young Noodles aside and says, just for a moment, let's not live in that by hook or by crook, tooth and claw sort of bitter world. Let's look at the Torah and the poetry in it. She's inviting him to see that there's there is beauty in this world, and you can choose it. And I think that scene is just so powerful when he chooses not to choose it. And I really can't say enough about that, about the child actors. I think they were all just so true. I never felt like they phoned it in or that they're mugging. They were all just exceptional child actors of that era. And I really I have to again, James Woods is at peak 80s James Woods energy. It's sort of like this chaotic evil kind of, or maybe chaotic neutral kind of like Machiavelli on too many cups of espresso kind of frantic energy. I'm not, I think the only other place where I can think of like Woods at this level is like maybe Videodrome. He's just constantly shifting with discomfort or with ambition or energy. I think that's great. And then, De Niro's De Niro. He does that De Niro thing. So, I'm not in any place to have any opinions on a legendary actor like that. However, he does carry what he needs to carry in order to make the story outstanding. So I do love those actors, and particularly Elizabeth McGovern coming in later as the older Deborah. I think that relationship is just fantastically acted. And so to your point, even if Leone doesn't hit on what is the essence of America as seen by these individuals, he does say America is the backdrop, and this is sort of the difficult and challenging times and relationships between these three that happened. Yeah. So the performances absolutely carry that. So I very much enjoyed that.
Yeah, the time period is we're post World War II with The Godfather, which is a very different era for gangsterism than the kind of heyday of what people think of with prohibition and gun malls and all that kind of stuff. And it's a lot more Little Caesar than it is the Warner Brothers era gangster movies than it is kind of the post World War II noir movies. And I think significantly you're with The Godfather, you do get into that relationship in part two with the senator and with Michael. In part one, that's when you start having the commissions, right, who are worried about organized crime, which then ripples through all the film noir and gangster movies of that era, which deeply, obviously, impacted. I think the how they were looking at this story, because that's what they pick up with in the 60s, right? So the stuff in the 20s in the Prohibition era, it's just a very different era of gangsterism. And when you start talking about like the corruption and all of that and what it left open, it's stuff that we fight with every day now through a lot of how we've dealt for the past 80 years with drug laws in the country. Right. But it's this, we've seen it in the like Scarface and other things of kind of the opportunity you really are providing for people who are motivated and to get this leg up, and then to get into that layer of corruption and then into the legitimate world. This movie leaves out a huge gap. They try and explain it in a sentence or two of how Max was able to then pivot to become Bailey. Basically, it sounds like he went to the West Coast and reinvented himself.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Which doesn't feel entirely satisfying when he's living back in New York. But who knows who would recognize whom after 30 years. I think that's, safe enough. But I do think it tries to do some stuff with corruption, not least of which is we talked about like the angel of Deborah. She's completely compromised by the end of the film.
Right.
Which is to me, like if this were a lesser story or a lesser writer or director, that character would remain the virgin, figure.
Right.
This like, well, it's the female who's, and that's a classic noir thing, right? You always have the woman, you have the femme fatale, and then you have kind of the pretty girlfriend who's going to save the guy at the end. But she doesn't stay on that track. Like she got compromised sometime 20, 30 years ago. We don't know. She may have been with Max as far back as when he decided to go to the West Coast.
Right.
Because he
Right.
says we know that she's going into LA. That's where she's leaving when Elizabeth McGovern departs that part of the film. So,
Yes. Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent point, which is that, if I'm lensing a gangster movie from Godfather, that's post noir. So it's the gangster as an entree to a bigger idea. Whereas I think you're absolutely right. Looking at something like a Jackie Cooper movie or Little Caesar or the original Scarface, would be the right kind of period to think about this. It's not gangsterism as an entree into noir. It's gangsterism as organized street toughs with bigger bankrolls and deadlier weapons. So I think that's a great way to see it. Is like, don't put this in it's gangsterism, but it's much closer to the films of the 30s than the imagined era of 46, 47 that Coppola presents in Godfather. So I think that's an outstanding perspective to bring to it. And yeah, I do wonder, in some places where Deborah was compromised, it seems like when Noodles first encounters her after coming out of jail, she's kind of cold and kind of distant, and she shows up at the big party because Mo kind of cajoles her or maybe threatens her into it. So something's happened along the way. She's taken a few bumps, but I guess I don't feel like I feel like she may have made some questionable decisions to get to where she was, or to be to aid and abet the fact that her brother is running a safe house for gangsters and a gambling den. But you do feel like there was something that was really, really finally irrevocably lost during the rape scene. There's I definitely you definitely feel like she was taken down a lot by that, and as her train chuffs out of the station, she there's no crying, there's no screaming, she just kind of closes the shade on that whole part of her life and says that I'm going to California. I'm going to start a new. It's hard not to quote Led Zeppelin here. She's going to California. She's going to make a new start, but she's lowering that shade just utterly on her New York life. And there's a lot of echoes in that from people who would have been contemporaneous to her, like the real deal Bugsy Siegel, born in Brooklyn, creates Las Vegas and all that's associated with that. As with many of the New York Jewish ghetto folks who basically take that Hollywood trip, change their name and start making silent films and then later the talkies. So I think you're absolutely right. It is that there's a shift there, and there's a profound. It's a profound character beat for her, and it is absolutely. It's rending to watch that, to say, no, Noodles, this is the one pure thing you ever had in your life, and for something so flimsy as just animal lust, you're gonna throw something perfect away, and he does.
Yeah. It's comparing it to Once Upon a Time in the West. I mean, Jill is a completely different character, right? She's a madam, a hooker, who's lying about who she is. She talks about, you go ahead and rape me, doesn't matter. I'll get some hot water, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, when you hear that speech.
Right. That is a tough speech to take. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's an interesting comparison of how, I mean, Leone in a few of his movies has kind of a woman as this flex point or the thing that everything kind of hangs on. But they're never the same character twice, including Fistful of Dollars and whatnot. And I mean, he didn't invent Deborah. She comes from Harry Gray's book. But I do find his use of her kind of through this film as kind of, if you follow her in the scene she has at the end where she's able to kind of hide it in the whole scene of her being in Cleopatra was not in the original cut. That was fascinating to see that added in and to see kind of where he was going with that, because you just see her in the kabuki makeup in the original cut. It still works. I think it's still a beautiful scene. But it had so much more impact with Noodles watching her and understanding the Antony Cleopatra relationship. and her never quite getting the makeup off to both hide, she's not aged, she's able to retain this perfect visage. And you can start to see it, the kind of cracks as she does wipe it away. They do enough makeup to do that on her. But she's a mess, right? And she has this great line of, "Oh, now you're a bad actor." When it was like
Right.
it's like this intentionally badly delivered line about, "I don't know anything. I don't know anything." And so there's a million little things in this. If as I watch it as kind of like this more personal story between these three characters, instead of what necessarily are we saying about the same themes as The Godfather, which I totally get. Like why that's a weakness. That's the kind of stuff in this movie I've really latched on to over the years.
Well, I mean, if that scene were missing, I would consider this a far less stellar movie. I really am not familiar with Elizabeth McGovern's body of work. I did watch her in a movie yesterday. I watched the latest edition of Downton Abbey. So she obviously had the career endurance to stand the test of time. But that scene in particular, where it almost feels like something out of Hamlet, right? Where he invites the mechanicals to put on a play of the murder that he assumes has happened. Here she is in a play about doomed lovers, and she was apparently convincing and gets accolades for that while she's wearing a makeup. And so the sort of question is, does the superhero wear the mask, or to hide who they are, or is who they are the thing with the mask, and they put on the mask of normalcy to hide it? Again, homage back to the often misunderstood David Carradine soliloquy in Kill Bill 2. But there's that wonderful lesson. The question about lying, about who we are, and the masks we wear, and how long you can wear a mask before it becomes permanent. And it's a wonderful segue, because that immediately goes from what Deborah is hiding as to who Max is hiding as, because immediately after that, Noodles puts two and two together and realizes that the place he needs to go is to meet this sort of mysterious political power, who's hosting a party somewhere nearby.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember, because it's been, I saw this the first time in, I think, 95, 96. Were you able to figure out from at the outset that Bailey was Maxie?
The thing that gave it away to me is that the bodies that they pull out from the fire, was only one of them was charred beyond recognition. Two of them look like they basically caught a bullet. And then I did think it was kind of suspicious that the one character that we're given pretty early as being a little bit smarter than the rest, a little bit more cunning than the rest, was the one who had no identifiable remains. So I just kind of caught that. I thought that's a little weird that, what happened there. And, I think at this point, I'm not sure how to segue into this gracefully, but at the end of the movie, you're given some pause to think about, did this ever really happen? And, and it felt very much, the only film that I think is comparable to this is maybe like a Lynch movie, particularly like Mulholland Drive or Lost Highway, where all of a sudden you're like, I've been watching a story, and then my interpretation of Mulholland Drive is that it's the slow oxygen death of a failed actress, imagining how her life could have gone. So you watch this Mobius strip movie that is actually just like an imagined dream in the last few moments of a brain functioning. And so then the way the story loops around with this sort of opium den scene, and the way Maxie seems to disappear behind a garbage truck, lots of things at the end suddenly make this movie go from being a gangster movie, or maybe a very tragic triangle set amidst this sort of larger story about America, to a David Lynch kind of like, was any of this ever real? So I guess my question for you is how am I supposed to interpret the ending? Because it kind of, I thought we were playing, one game, and then suddenly Leonie pulls the carpet out from under me, and I'm like, wait, what was I standing on here? So I guess my question would be, and if you think it's appropriate,
I think
to shift to
sure.
did it happen? Was this whole thing real? Was it Was it the diluted ravings of an alcoholic former gangster in Buffalo who never went back to the Manhattan of his youth, or yeah, I guess. What do you think?
I think I had never really pondered that as a possibility until watching it this time.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was like they're cutting back to the last moment of the old life that he lived, and if was he having a moment of joy thinking of all the stuff that he had with those guys. That was always how I interpreted that. Like he's high on opium and things were good until they weren't, and he's having the last, he's shooting his wad at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Because after this, he's, he has to run for his life and he's gone forever.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a fair interpretation to say that everything in the future in the 60s is a fantasy that he is concocting there, and he's giving his best friend an out, and he's having his best friend apologize to him for making this life so difficult. And also Deborah is ending up kind of miserable in where she's at. She's not in the best place. So he's getting a little bit of psychological revenge on her. I think you can read it that way. I always find movies, unless it's Lynch who sets out to do those things, to be a little unsatisfying. Part of why I find it unsatisfying is then I made the mistake of trying to watch maybe the first 30-45 minutes again of the movie with the commentary. And once the guy latched on to the idea of the back third being a dream, listening to him was insufferable. Because then he's going, and you can see how this is dreamlike and that is dreamlike. And I'm like, oh, dude, that's not a way to talk about it. Like, stop. Yes, the pacing is plotting in this movie. Like, we should be honest about that too. Yeah, it's Tartakovsky-esque, right? It's
right.
And I am totally fine with that kind of pacing if it serves the story. And I feel like in this movie it does. I don't, however, agree. It feels like a dream because it's slow. It's like, no, they're deliberately taking you through all these things. He'd overthought every single scene here. It is not working on a scale of narrative economy. This would be a very different movie if he was doing a Warner Brothers gangster movie. And so they're also covering a lot of history here with the characters. So they're trying to do a lot of it, as Leone has always done, without words. Like, I mean, you can watch the entire first third of Once Upon a Time in the West without any dialogue and understand everything that's happening. Right. So I totally think that's a fine interpretation. I think it's fine to kind of also live in Schrodinger's box and not know which it is. I think it's fine to live in the box and not be sure what the hell happened to Max at the end of the movie. I will say I watched the extras, and James Woods was interviewed in '99 about it, and he says, I have no idea what happened to Max.
Okay. Well, that's somewhat reaffirming. For me watching it, I didn't avail myself of any commentary, before I saw it. Mm-hmm. Watching Noodles walk off, I'm halfway like, is that truck going to run him over? And then I see that figure come out behind him, whom we assume to be Max. And then he's kind of walking, and then the truck starts up and moves past him. Uh-huh. And I thought maybe this was a recall back to the original scene where Noodles and Max first meet. And they're going to do a trick where they're going to disappear behind the cart as they, quote, roll the guy who just left the bar. Mm-hmm. And I thought maybe Leone was inviting us to think that maybe what Max does is he hops on the backside of the cart, now a large dump truck. Yeah. He basically hops on the back of the cart. Noodles doesn't see him, and Noodles gets kind of distracted by the masher, and off goes Max. Max feels like he's at the end of his second existence, and maybe Max runs off and begins his third existence under a new name, in Panama or something like that. I thought that was the implication.
I think so. What Woods himself had said was, all you need to know is, because also they didn't use Woods for that shot. They used his photo double intentionally for that shot. He said, so you wouldn't be quite sure what the hell was happening. And he says, all you need to know is Max is not going to be there for dinner the next night. Like, yeah, he's either disappeared, he's grabbed onto the truck and he's been whisked away, or he's realized, the thing he has asked Noodles to do, he cannot do, and he understands why. So he has to take it in hand himself. I think both things are satisfying in knowing that we're never going to hear from Max again at this point. And he's had to give up this world he's built. And it can tie back into whether or not this is a dream. The idea of, well, why is it called Once Upon a Time in America, is something that people have really latched onto as to, well, it's a dream. It's like, well, we never said that about Once Upon a Time in the West. We understood that was a tale of the West, of this mythic West. And I think the Once Upon a Time in America title is the mythos of the American success story. And what we take for granted about people, kind of earning, the how they earn their wealth and how they end up being successful, and kind of the corruption and the people they step on along the way, and the betrayals that are inherent in that. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to tell people their interpretation of the ending is wrong.
Right. So, I mean, do you think that basically the story is the sort of youth happens, Noodles does time, they build a criminal empire, it falls apart, Noodles flees to Buffalo, and Max goes west, Max does his life, but and becomes some sort of a power broker at it, but nothing more. The last third, do you think that's his the fancies of Noodles by himself, imagining what his life was?
I think I take the movie as completely concrete.
Okay.
That what we see is what we see. And I mean, I can be talked out of it if Leone's ghost were to show up and go, no,
right.
You got it so wrong. I'd be like, all right.
The reason I gave it a little bit more credit as like maybe this is a whole dream sequence is because there's an awful lot of convenient things that happen that very much like Mulholland Drive. Like, in Mulholland Drive, it's like, okay, these two sort of super sleuth girlfriends are on the trail. And then for no explicable reason, one of them finds a strange blue key that matches a strange blue cube that's completely out of place in the narrative. And that is kind of the trigger to unlocking sort of this secondary reality. And like, there's a couple things in Noodles' in the 60s era Noodles detective story where it's like, why would somebody have put a key to a left luggage locker inside of a mausoleum? Like, who could have predicted that Noodles would choose to go there and sit there and look behind the door and see this key? Like, why would he? Okay,
that was not in the original version.
Aha. Okay.
So I've lived my whole life until this viewing without Louise Fletcher being a part of this movie.
I see.
So yeah, I mean, I read that as in this viewing, this is the thing. It doesn't matter whether Noodles shows up or not. This is like the regret that he has that's led him to build the mausoleum for these guys has led him to also like, here's the key. Like maybe they were all Giants fans. He's going to hang a Giants pennant in there. And the key to me, that was the thing, was we were all in this together. Here's the key to the thing, and his regret. There's definitely something to him building a multi-million-dollar mausoleum for these guys who died 30 years before, right? And so the amount of guilt and the fact that he, whatever's happening with him in his years here, where he's returned to New York and maybe feels closer than he had when he was on the West Coast, and now he's enshrining those guys. He's whatever. I mean, Max is clearly going through something, and if you read it as a concrete story, I do think you can do it as a breadcrumb trail of, yeah, that was too coincidental. They don't say explicitly what was going on, and
Right.
I'm totally fine with that. So
Yeah, I was gonna say, because that one leads to this one suitcase that's full of newspapers, but it also leads to a briefcase with cash that says "for your next job," and it's like, well, how did whoever is plotting this sort of like master scavenger hunt know that Noodles would put two and two together and figure out to go to this one place at the right time and see this thing? It felt very coincidental, and that's where I started to get pulled with the idea that maybe this wasn't actually
right.
a straight above the board story.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a movie at the end of the day too, right? I mean,
sure enough.
So I mean, I'm willing to follow some breadcrumbs that go here and there. I don't know entirely what the point is of the movie if the 60s portion isn't there. Like it doesn't tie up the, like, him having this vision. It's a neat idea, but it makes me wonder, well, so what at the end? It makes it feel a lot different to me. Anytime a movie, unless it's a Lynch movie, let me do my caveat there. When people go, "Oh, that was all a dream," I'm like, "Well, you've wasted my time, sir." Like,
right,
as much as if you sat and wasted my morning telling me about your dream. Like, I don't care for that. And I think that there's a lot more to be said about any of the themes that we're worried about with gangsterism and corruption, and how it's kind of becomes a thing for real power in the United States. If, in the whole speech with Treat Williams and all that, if all of that's real.
Right.
And I just don't like latching on to things being a dream, personally.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Did you have an impression of what happens to Noodles at the end? Like, he walks out of the party, and do we just assume he goes back to Buffalo? Or, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's,
I mean, what he does, I mean, there's the possibility he's going to remain in New York. We have no idea what he's been doing for 30 years. We don't know if he's been working in a hardware store or, what. He makes it sound like he has been probably trying to be as hidden as possible. I don't know if he stayed in Buffalo. I mean, we know that's where he went. I would think, like, look, you would understand in that era, like, Buffalo is where you go to get, Buffalo has that big train, or had that big train station.
Right.
That's where you would have gone to go west.
Right.
And so I kind of think he probably went west himself, maybe to the Midwest or something. I can't believe he would have stayed anywhere in the New York greater tri-state area.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, particularly in that era of history. I mean, the Erie Canal in Buffalo, therefore, would have been like roughly like Hartfield Jackson Airport, in Atlanta. Now it's like from there the world opens up, and the Erie Canal as gateway to the Great Lakes, the Midwest. Who knows what? Yeah, so it's not necessarily reasonable to assume that he stayed put there.
Yeah.
But, all right. Yeah. All right. Cool.
I mean, I think that part of it is, at the end, is it all comes to nothing, right? And I think that there's something to that as well. Like, if all of this led to, Max has built mansions, but at the end of the day, he's about to end up in jail, where he was going to be anyway, where he's been avoiding doing all of, for his entire career. He stayed one step ahead of everything, but now it's going to catch up on him on an epic scale.
Right.
So he either has to start over or throw himself into a garbage truck, one of the two. And for Noodles, who's been hiding out, it genuinely is, what was the fucking point? Like, and I think that is in its own way kind of profound. Of, you've been hiding out, they knew where you were. You've been, you got nothing out of everything that you kind of built, and now you're going to go back to it. Like you're too old to start building something at this point. You're certainly not getting, Deborah's not going to be in the picture. At most, you're going to be playing cards with Fat Mo after hours, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So my assumption is it doesn't really matter. It's kind of how you get there and what you do. And I think there's something pointed about him seeing the cars of revelers go by right after Max. Like it's both, that's very dreamlike. I think that seeing those like kind of vintage cars full of people drive by, I don't know if that actually happens.
Right.
Like even within the concrete version of readings of like, he sees people fucking Gatsbying it up flying by.
Right.
And, he that's his past, like disappearing into the rearview mirror for him.
Yeah, that last scene, or that scene as he's walking away, he sees the revelers, and he's kind of like, I think maybe he kind of is returning to his quintessential sort of outsider status, and is kind of realizing that's what his lot, this life is. It reminded me a lot of another movie that had a really kind of similarly, it felt jarringly tacked on, was Easy Rider, right? Like, Kid America, Peter Fonda turns and he says, we blew it. And then, shortly after, the next scene is them like getting shotgunned by hillbillies on the road, or whatever that was meant to signify. And like watching that in the 90s, like I still don't understand what that meant to people in the 60s. And when I've asked about it, people of that generation said that, oh, it's the recognition that the hippie thing wasn't going to work. And I didn't get that, but maybe there is some sort of like level of some sort of confessional for Noodles in that, like in seeing it feels sort of tacked on, and you realize is exactly as you say, it comes to nothing. And maybe the best thing is a steady stream of opium. I was like, well, okay, there's, Michael Corleone faces a reckoning, and Noodles' reckoning is not in a court or at the hand of a meaner younger predator like him. It's just this kind of acceptance that like, yeah, that there was some hijinks along the way, but at the end of it, it amounted to nothing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is like Michael Corleone's working at this, a metaphorical level for America. I don't think this movie works on that level. I think this movie is very much about interpersonal relationships and the family you make along the way. And there's a reason we don't see what happened for 30 years to him in between. Like that's clearly irrelevant. We don't know if he has children. We don't know if he's married. We don't know anything. And he, I don't think he's wearing a wedding band in the movie, but I can't remember. But I genuinely think like it is entirely about how these people ended up just doing a shit ton of damage to each other. And to me, that actually is kind of a fascinating, like everything's personal at the end of the day. Like in so many gangster movies that say it's just business, whatever. But at the end of the day, it's always ends up being about the personal shit. And that to me is kind of what the movie is. And it's this, and that's why I love the fact it does all the intersplicing of all the different periods, because that's really how you deal with people, right? You don't, even if it's been decades, say you run into your high school love, right? You're right back in it with them.
Right.
Like you're able to pick up and have conversations with those people. All the old emotions you put away, they're right back at the surface. And I don't know if the last time you saw anyone from high school was, but unless you have kind of a continuous relationship with them,
for sure,
you snap right back to kind of where you were in a very strange way. And that's kind of how I see this film operating. And part of why I found it so fascinating when I saw it when I was 21, something like that, was I was much more of the 1932 era, like that age. That was kind of my mentality, but definitely could remember, well, we were kids along the way. We grew up together, and understand how those relationships are built. and there's not really a lot of other things that do this, right? I mean, there's that kind of show what is the setup for how these people came to be. It's kind of a bold thing to do these three different eras, and frankly, the old age makeup works. Who knew De Niro would end up looking exactly like that 30 years later?
Yeah, uncanny.
Yeah, I mean, Woods to himself looks not unlike what the makeup is by the time he's Bailey. And McGovern has kind of remained looking exactly the same for 30 years somehow.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's to me, that's really some fascinating storytelling to really get into kind of the guts of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I was looking forward to this discussion because I was wondering if there was a contour I just didn't perceive, but I think, relensing it as gangsterism as the framing for a personal story about interpersonal relationships and the damage we do to each other. I think that makes it a much stronger story. And so maybe as mismarketed, or maybe the my reading up on it was mismarketed. But from your perspective, I think it works a lot better. And being open to the idea of that, as we consider the damage that these people can do to each other, how they're able to damage each other so much requires that storytelling of, or at least encourages the storytelling of the hijinks and the capers, how they first meet, what they meant to each other once versus what they mean to each other now. And so I think that works a lot stronger when we consider that from the perspective you've presented today.
I don't think it's a movie for everybody. I've never believed that. I remember talking to a friend about it after I'd watched it and been like, I just saw the most incredible movie. She's like, should I watch it? I was like, no.
Right.
I don't think you would want to sit through 3.5 hours of what I personally liked about this movie. For me, this is a canon movie. I absolutely, it's had profound impact about how I think about story, how I think about with the potential for what you could do with story. And the look and the feel of the movie, I understand it didn't work as well for you. There's some shots in this that are so fucking good. The scene when they think they're on top of the world as kids just before they have the shooting.
Beautiful, that scene. That's on the poster for a reason. That whole 15-minute arc there, culminating in the stabbing, but the lead up to them putting on clothes beyond their station to go to a train station to as their bank vault. That whole sequence. You're absolutely right. The costuming is phenomenal. The scene setting is phenomenal. The set is phenomenal. You're absolutely. Make no doubt. I may have made some nits here, but that there are splashes of like, this is why you'd ever want to be in this business, and Lanny's certainly capable of delivering these masterpiece segments.
Yeah, and I anyway, I just think it's almost like because it's so messy as a film. Like I feel like if you can kind of start piecing the pieces together and try and figure out, Leone was too close to it. Maybe he was too in the weeds with it. He couldn't. He had what they were saying. There's a bonus on the Blu-ray that he knew exactly how the movie was going to be so far in advance that he'd worked out the music cues a decade before they shot it, and he already had the music on the set to tell people, at this beat you do this, at that beat you do that.
Wow.
And he could do pretty much the entire story. When the producer who eventually funded the movie, apparently he sat and told him the story in real time. He said, and it ran for 3 hours and 47 minutes. I counted. He's like, and at the end of it, I got hugged him and said, let's do this.
Oh, wow.
The heartbreaker about all of this is part of why I think people weren't talking about it as much in the 90s, and maybe over the decades, it's become a bigger thing. The initial release of it in the States, they cut it into a linear movie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what was released. And people were basically like, what the fuck is this? It's just a very long movie. Why does this exist? If it's not a nonlinear movie, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And they'd also cut out a bunch of time on it because then suddenly things don't seem like they fit or don't, and it's like, well, everything was referencing other things. And if you don't do it nonlinear, it doesn't work. In noir, if you want to pull from that, gangster movies are usually pretty linear. Noir, however, often flashbacks, people talking about, this happened 20 years ago, this happened 5 years ago, all that
Sure.
good stuff. And sometimes they do it in dialogue and sometimes they show it. Um, and a lot of things start in media res, and this movie definitely starts in media res, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it I think it's just got a lot of stuff that I personally like. It was part of my like, oh, I like Miller's Crossing. Oh, I really like The Godfather. Oh, I
Mhm.
really like, these westerns. What? The same guy made a gangster movie. Holy shit. I really like this. This is feeding me, maybe too foundational for me. And I also am aware, like, I am the last person. There's a good reason I probably would not have done well had I ever used my film degree and gone to LA, because I'm always aware of like, this movie is amazing. Oh, it was a box office flop is almost invariably where I end up. It's like,
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
thing with like Buckaroo Banzai. Everything should be that.
Right, right, right.
Southland Tales. Everything should be that. And there's a reason you don't put me in charge of these things. So
Yeah, I mean, for ambition alone, I mean, and for succeeding and completing a task with the scope is, no small feat. So by all means, I am glad I've seen it. Um, for sure, for sure, a
but
great
it's
achievement.
a tough thing to go, oh, I'm gonna go back and rewatch because it's 4 hours and 10 minutes.
That's right. Yeah, I did it. I did it in. I think that the Apple rental gave me so many hours to watch it, and I think I just it was like my library book is due back tomorrow. Like that kind of put the final push on me to get that. I think that last 90 minutes out of the way. But yeah, it is a commitment, and but I mean that's why some of us like maximalist literature. I personally am a huge fan of Infinite Jest. People say like, but it doesn't have an ending. It doesn't make sense, and it's like, you know what? It's written across time. It's written across scope. It's written in 1,000 different voices, all of which collided together in this very, very strange sort of future dystopia. And Wallace himself said, well, if you can't look from the guidelines I give you at the end and kind of see where it ends up, then the story didn't work for you. He's trusting that you were so caught up in that circular discourse of the voices and of the motivations and of the pieces that you see where he was going, and he doesn't need to write the sort of boring prosaic stuff, because that's all either prologue or epilogue and you don't care. And I think in some ways this kind of has that same quality of maximalist literature. It's got everything, including the kitchen sink. I mean, including the can, as one young lady politely calls it. It's got everything about life. And if given those two guidelines, you can see how it would all fit together, you've gotten what the movie's structure and internal velocity was intended to communicate. If not, you're kind of left there saying like, I don't understand how these parts interrelate. And if you were to see a linear cut of it, you'd be like, well, this is kind of boring. It's a long story that ends nowhere. So
Yeah.
absolutely, it is. I guess it's a piece of maximalist filmmaking. Would be the short TLDR version of that entire rant.
I appreciate that point of view. I personally haven't read Infinite Jest yet, but yeah, I think sometimes I really enjoy that in something. It was kind of, to go back to Lynch, which seems like a really weird thing to go off of Leone, but that was very much how I felt at the end of the 5 years ago season of Twin Peaks. I know less now than I did at the end of season 2, right? I know less now than I did at the end of Fire Walk with Me,
Right.
but I get it at the same time. Like Laura's scream at the end was all I really needed to understand what he'd been trying to do for the past however many episodes.
Oh, fascinating.
And sorry, I just spoiled a TV show the whole season. Sorry, everybody. But I think that there's something to this kind of filmmaking that it's not, you can probably do it now with TV, with where TV is now, but
Mm-hmm.
you can't really do it as a movie. The studio execs just didn't know what to do with it and just kind of let it die on the vine. And it's just crushing to know that like that part of business overcame what had been this vision of this auteur, and I use the word auteur. I don't like using it. I don't think most movies are actually an auteurship. I think this one is. I think a lot of what Leone does is, and I they took it and tried to just turn it into something they could understand and package, and it fucked the movie up forever. I mean, the fact that now this was the original cut more or less, and you're having to watch parts of it that are on like reversal, whatever, the from the assembly cut, and the audio is all jacked up, and like Louise Fletcher's all like blanched out in her shots because the color was never corrected for, and that, but that's all they've got. But it's amazing that we have it, and it's amazing that we got this cut years later.
Yeah.
But it's also helps put the movie a bit more into the realm of mythos, that it's like, well, there's like 4 different cuts,
Right.
You enter into Blade Runner territory now. So
That's right. Where the reality of the reality of the one cut and the true vision versus the marketer's vision is divergent.
Yeah, and it's kind of sweet that people this late in the game still had enough affection for Leone to try and make it happen, and they did. So
for sure.
Anyway, we could talk about this movie for another 2 hours. I don't think people want to put up with it. I'll be curious how many people have ever actually even seen this movie, and kind of hear what other people's interpretations of it were, or where they kind of fell on it. I like I said, I know, like it's not something I super recommend, and I know a lot of people just aren't into it. So for whatever reason. So but anyway, thank you so much for pitching it. I was super excited when you're like, let's do this. I was like, shit, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for the discussion. It is big enough to carry some scrutiny and to ask some questions. There's definitely some parts in it that you're like, ooh, that's rough, and ooh, wow, I can't believe they just came out and said that. Even in films from 30 years ago, there's some things that to modern sensibilities feel pretty dated or jaded or a little too European for an American audience. It bears scrutiny. It bears questions, but that's a tribute to its strength and the robustness of storytelling that's built into it. It does make enough of an impression that you actually want to understand it. I think there's lots of wonderful aspects that can be drawn from it, from the storytelling. So
I think that's the best thing. I would just, that it makes you want to understand it, I think that's a testament to, I mean, it's why I've watched Stalker over and over. I mean, it's
right.
I think, yeah, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
All right. And some one may not work, but again, if you love acting and if you love the technical elements of film, it is a great piece to experience.
All right, we'll be back soon. I think we're going to lower it all the way down to "Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead."
That's right. That's our next step.
I have no idea what we'll do next. But thank you all so much for listening to us, and we will be back soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. that about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.